You'll get over heartache. You'll get over heartache.
Good evening, Silish, and welcome to yet another episode of What's Happening Now with Laura. A few months ago, I would have prepped you, I would have gotten you prepared for our annual Let's Talk About Sex series. And that didn't happen for a number of reasons. You know, sometimes there will cliche, life gets in the way. But something has happened that has hit home for me. And I thought, why not start the series? Let's talk about sex. You know, an increasing number of young people are engaging in a range of sexual activity before the age of 16. And the reasons behind this behavior can vary considerably. In some cases, the activity will be wholly consensual. In others, it will happen in response to peer pressure or as a result of abuse or exploitation. Young people who are sexually active will have differing needs. Therefore, services and practitioners must provide a range of responses. But does our legislation set out the legal issues or parameters, guidance for practitioners on how they can strike a balance between assuring the freedom of young people to make decisions and protecting them from activity that could give rise to immediate harm and or longer-term adverse consequences? The law is clear that sexual intercourse with young people under the age of 16 is illegal. However, it does not follow that every case presents a child protection concern. For instance, two 15-year-olds may engage in what one may consider to be experimental sex, exploring each other's bodies. So in this case, it does not follow that every case presents a child protection concern. But it is important that a proportionate response is made, whether it's consensual, as in the case I mentioned earlier, where two 15-year-olds or two 14-year-olds are exploring each other and experimenting, or in the case of a 40-year-old, for instance, engaging in sexual activity with a 15-year-old. Tonight, we are starting our second annual Let's Talk About Sex series, focusing on the underaged child. Now, rape is a type of sexual assault, usually involving sexual intercourse or other forms of sexual penetration. Now, I know by now you're wondering where's she going with that. We're talking about sex and then we're talking about rape, but just wait for it. Rape is a type of sexual assault, usually involving sexual intercourse or other forms of sexual penetration carried out against a person without the person's consent. Remember that, without the person's consent. Sexual intercourse or coitus or copulation is principally the insertion and thrusting of the penis into the vagina for sexual pleasure, reproduction, or both. Now, I think at this point I need to let you know that some of the content, and maybe I should have cautioned you earlier at the top of the show, some of the content will be very, very explicit. But I think it's very important that parents in particular, members of society who may not have children, but who have the well-being of children at heart, they need to understand. And in particular, too, adolescents and young teenagers between the ages of 13 and 16. You need to hear this. You need to understand what happens to your body. You need to understand the psychological damage. You need to understand ways of identifying predators. So I would encourage parents to sit with their children, even as young as 12, because we all know that sexual grooming and predatory activities do happen to children younger than 12 and 13 and 14. So I would caution you to listen, but in the event that you think some of the content is too much, at least you would be able to listen and discern for yourselves and be able to break it down to your child in your terms when the time is right. So again, sexual intercourse or coitus or copulation is principally the insertion and thrusting of the penis into the vagina for sexual pleasure, reproduction, or both. The act may be carried out by physical force, coercion, abuse of authority, or against a person who is incapable of giving valid consent, such as one who is unconscious, incapacitated, has an intellectual disability, or is below the legal age of consent, which is 16 in St. Lucia. The term rape is sometimes used interchangeably with the term sexual assault. Now, sexual penetration is the insertion of a body part or other object into a body orifice, such as the vagina, anus, or mouth, as part of human sexual activity or animal sexual activity. Rape by strangers is usually less common than rape by people the victim knows. And male on male and female on female prison, especially in the prison, rapes are common but may be the least reported forms of rape. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It simply means that there are stigmas attached, taboos, things that we're not allowed to talk about in decent company that causes these incidents to go under the radar. People, especially children who have been raped, can be traumatized and develop post-traumatic stress disorders. Serious injuries can result along with the risk of pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. A person may face violence or threats from the rapist, and in some cultures, from the victim's family and relatives. And it's very important that we bear this in mind, because sometimes in our communities, in our homes, in our villages, in our towns, in our city, you will find that there is a victim of rape physically by the perpetrator. But then that person is continued to be raped over and over and over and over and over, because the rape culture in St. Lucia is so prevalent. Either we don't believe you, or you think you asked for it, whether it is because of the way you dressed or because of your past behavior. I need to stress here that nobody, especially children under the age of 16, asked or can ask for sex, much less to be raped. And I will repeat that. No person, especially our children under the age of 16, can ask for sex or ask to be raped, whether it be because of the way we are dressed or by past behavior. Tonight, my guest is from Caring Hands Foundation, and we'll talk a little bit more about Caring Hands Foundation, who they are, what they do. And we are going to focus on underage children who have been introduced to sexual activities by older men and women, constituting rape in the eyes of the law. Caring Hands Foundation is a non-profit organization working towards addressing the issues affecting children in St. Lucia. Over the course of its existence, the organization has implemented activities aimed at empowering people to treat children with dignity and respect. The organization has in the past advocated for better programs and policies for children. The group includes persons working in various helping professions, inclusive of social work, and individuals who have an interest in resolving issues affecting children in the society. At this point, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll sit with my guest and we will delve into the substantive matter at hand, talking about sex as it pertains to the underage child. Stay tuned.
You'll get over heartache. You'll get
Welcome back, St. Lucia, and thank you for staying tuned to what's happening now with Laura. So at the top of the show, you would have heard what the topic for this evening is. Cue music.
Sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Let's talk about. Come on. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
So you would have heard that our topic this evening is let's talk about sex. But wait, it's not about all the good things and the bad things, but maybe some of the bad things. Because we are going to be focusing on the underage child, the psychological damage that happens when our children engage in sex at a young age. But not just engage in sex as two kids experimenting and exploring their bodies, trying to figure out why they're feeling certain things at certain ages. But the deplorable and denigrating act of adults forcing themselves on kids under the age of 16. You know, sometimes we wonder what sort of an animal would force himself on a child. But to me, I ask myself, what kind of an idiot would think that it's okay for a 40-year-old to engage in sexual activities with a minor? And then you have those persons who would say, but she asked for it. Look at what she's done in the past. Look at her behavior. She's a wild one, that one. But the law says that to engage in sexual activity is not just egregious, it's illegal. It's unlawful. Why would an adult who, let's say, has a girlfriend or a wife, who has children, engage in that kind of activity, which, by the way, is termed rape? It tells us that rape is not about sexual gratification. It's not about being swift. It's not about wanting to have it. It's about control, especially when that activity accompanies threats. This evening, as I said at the top of the show, my guest is from the Caring Hands Foundation, and we are going to be focusing on underage children who have been introduced to sexual activities by older men and or women. My guest this evening is Kendall Elva. Welcome, Kendall.
Thank you very much, Laura, for having me and Caring Hands Foundation. And let me say a pleasant good evening to all St. Lucians and non-St. Lucians who are viewing this program this evening.
Now, Kendall, this is not your first rump in my yard or sitting on my couch. And I must say that previous times has been under more pleasant circumstances. But this is one that we cannot ignore. This is one that we cannot leave until it's sexual abuse, eradicating the sexual abuse against children and women. We cannot leave it for International Children's Day. We cannot leave it. It is something that we have to keep at the top of our minds and talk about over and over and over again until we change the mindset and the culture of our people.
Yes, I certainly agree with you on this matter. Many times we focus on these social problems that are affecting children, normally on International Children's Day, that is sometime in November, or days that have been set aside by the United Nations and the World Health Organization to observe such maladies, and we as a society need to try to prevent it. But I think as a society we need to recognize that we have to be consistent in terms of bringing attention to these issues, in terms of sensitizing the public about the causes, the impact, and how such matters can be addressed. And there is not a day in the week, there is not a time that a child somewhere in the world is not being sexually abused. And that is something I believe that we as a society need to respond to in a very urgent and comprehensive manner. Because children are a very precious resource. They are the persons that we are going to be looking to resolve some of the developmental challenges that we face. Children are persons who have significant dignity and worth. And as much as possible, we need to ensure that children are not exposed to activities that compromise their holistic development. We need to have a society where every child experiences love, where every child is able to self-actualize and achieve his or her biggest dreams and aspirations. But sadly, as you have indicated, there are social issues such as child sexual abuse, which is mitigating against children flourishing in an environment that is conducive towards promoting their holistic development.
Absolutely. And I think too, the rape culture, you know, a lot of times when a child acts out or has found herself or himself in a situation, and then somebody, an adult, that I'm talking about a child who acts out and does things, rather than finding out why that child has acted out in that manner sexually, we tend to denigrate that child. We tend to point out all the flaws in that child, which we tend to say, oh, that child needs a good whooping. And so therefore, when an adult now takes advantage of that child, we tend to want to show sympathy and empathy for the adult who obviously knew right from wrong, and as opposed to the child whose mental faculties are not fully mature and fully developed. And instead of trying to empathizing with that child, we tend to take that empathy and place it for the adults in this case, perpetuating the rape culture. What do you think about the rape culture in St. Lucia and perhaps in the wider Caribbean?
Well, I clearly think that in terms of anybody trying to justify a child being abused or an individual being raped upon the basis that the child or the individual was asking for it, I think that this is nonsensical. I do not believe any individual can ask to be raped or a child can ask to be sexually molested, regardless of how the person dresses, because sometimes we typically say if somebody is dressed in a particular way that this person is asking for that to happen to them. I believe that this is very sad on the part of any individual who will come to this conclusion. Clearly, when there are acts of rape and child sexual abuse, we have to land the blame on the perpetrator of such act. I believe that people need to take responsibility for their actions, and we cannot blame children or persons who have been raped, because when we do that, we're actually re-victimizing that particular child or the individual who has been raped, and this does not help the situation. This actually allows for the child or the victim of rape to suffer greater psychological damages. And I believe that as a society, we have to act in a way where we hold the appropriate individuals accountable to ensure that our children are protected. So I'm one who believes that that is something that we have to look into. We have to get our people to understand that nobody can ask to be raped. This to me doesn't make any sense. And as such, responsibility has to be assumed by the person who committed the act.
But more importantly, I think when we talk about rape, we think about the forcible forcible
act or penetration.
Right, of penetration on that person. And in this case, and we're talking about the underage child, and in this case, the underage child. And we think about the monster lurking in the dark, the monster lurking in the alley. But as I said at the top of the show, most cases of rape are perpetrated by persons we know, persons that a child trusts.
Certainly.
Persons that they know, that they trust, that their parents trust. And then when this happens, it's very difficult for the child now to say, okay, this happened to me, unless something does not click. And unless the parents are perceptive, unless the teachers are perceptive, unless the members of the community where that child is from are perceptive and say, okay, wait a minute, this child is acting out of character, or why is this child behaving that way? One of my favorite, and it's kind of hard for me to say favorite when we're talking about something as disgusting as rape, but one of my favorite, for want of a better word, definitions of rape is actually from the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda in its landmark 1998 judgment. Use a definition of rape which did not use the word consent. Because a lot of the times we say, but she brought herself to the man. But a child under 16 can bring herself butt naked, gyrating on him, and from the top of the roof shouting out how she wants this man. She cannot consent. So this is why I like this definition, and it says a physical invasion of a sexual nature committed on a person under circumstances which are coercive.
Yes. Okay.
So there's no consent. The word consent isn't used, and I think a lot of the times because
any child under the age of 16 legally cannot consent to engaging in any sexual act.
Exactly. So I think a lot of the times when we use the word consent, we confuse the situation and we say, oh, but what was she doing there in the first place, or what was he doing there in the first place?
Of rape is that a lady can initially consent, and during the act she could indicate that, hey, she wants to stop. And as long as this has been communicated, any further action which is sexual is rape. And a lot of people need to understand that in terms of consent, it's not just in terms of what happens in the initial stages, but right throughout, the individual has the right to say no. No, I could stop.
Exactly. And I really want us to understand that, St. Lucia, that, and it's good that Kendall said that you could start off wanting it and something clicks and you're like, oh my gosh, this is not what I want. Why am I doing this? And say no. And your partner needs to stop. This is when adults are involved. But when a child is involved, whether it's a male child or a female child, and I think sometime, I think when I first started on the air, I did a genderization of sex, whether it's male gender or female gender, and we had determined, and I think maybe throughout this series we'll revisit that genderization of sex, because a boy can be raped by a male or by a female. He can be, and I think that's one of the taboos that we have, and we think, oh, you got sex and you're upset. Well, it's an invasion of his privacy and of his person. For one, but he has a right to choose. You know, when he's a child, another a right to choose, because as we said, the child doesn't have the right to say to give consent. But he has a right as a child to be preserved, to let his body develop, to grow, to understand what his body is going through, his mind is going through. You know, and when it comes to an adult and a child under the age of 16, there is no consent. There is nothing that a child under the age of 16, and correct me if I'm wrong, under the age of 16 can do to give consent. Legally, that is not possible. So when you're having an affair or when you're sleeping with a child under the age of 16, you are in effect raping that child. Raping that child. How can one identify without a child coming out and saying, I have been raped?
I think,
what are some of the signs that we can look out for to tell that there is something amiss with a child?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you have made, because many times when children have been abused, what you find is that they don't come out and say that they have been sexually abused, either because the person who has perpetrated the act would say, this is our little secret. That person may be a member of the family or somebody who's close to the family, and the child may believe that the parents will not accept that they have been raped, or actually believe the child when the child says these things. And this is something that we face a lot in our St. Lucian society, where there are instances a child may be molested by a stepfather, and due to the significant economic role that stepfather plays in the family, you find that the mother may not believe the child right away due to the dependency which is there in the family. But there are a number of signs that we could look for to see whether a child has been raped or has been sexually abused. There could be bruises in the genital area or anal area. The child could experience pain and communicate pain in the genital area. You could also have discharges. These are also things that we could look for. The classical signs of sexually transmitted infections. These things could also point to a child having been sexually abused. Pregnancy, in the instance that it is a female child, these things can point to you that that particular child has been exposed to a sexual act. These are some physical things that we could look for, but then there are emotional things that we can observe in the child. You may find that the child may actually carry out a sexual act on another child. That could be an instance to say that the child has been exposed to it. And let me say that exposure to sex doesn't necessarily have to be direct, but it could be a child being made to watch pornography, being made to watch nude photos. So all these things are aspects of the child learning about sex, which should not be permitted in that particular way. Children should know about sex, but not in terms of them watching pornography or, you know, or them engaging in a sexualized conversation.
Right. Because sometimes, and I want to put a pin in that, sometimes a child is exposed to sex through pornography, through watching, especially adolescents, watching those pornographic videos and pictures. And because their bodies are developing at that stage, at that point, they may not mentally figure it to be a sexual awareness, but their bodies are reacting to those photos on these videos in a certain way. And then they want to explore and they want to, you know, experiment. Yeah. These are signs that, like you said, something is amiss.
Yes, certainly.
Why are you all of a sudden so explicit and knowledgeable about those things?
And these are things that parents need to listen to and observe.
And also, I mean, in preparing for this show, I remember speaking with someone and said, you know, a lot of the times we adults are complicit because we will see a child walking by, and especially boys, men, they say, ija boy, ija boy, those are some of the things that we say, or we see a child and then we say, oh, but we never think, let us be the responsible adult and figure out why would that child at that age be so knowledgeable or be acting out in those sexual ways.
Another thing which I observe, let me just complete the emotional aspect of a child being abused sexually. Some of them, whenever the person who committed the act comes around, you find that they would try to withdraw from that person. Some children may also behave disruptively. Some children may also experience a state of depression. So you find that they would not be as bubbly as per usual. And you, as a parent, should know whether there's a change in the behavior of your child. You may find some children also starting to perform poorly at school or acting out at school. So all these things would indicate that something is wrong, and these are things that teachers and parents need to observe. But the other thing I wanted to add is that this is something that I've observed in our culture where children below the age of 5, you know, we make these jokes with them. This is a little girl, you know, take a little dance with a girl, or this is your girlfriend. And we say these things, and we say it innocently. But I think to an extent, this is an exposure to children at a young age, which is sexualized. And I do not necessarily know that this is an appropriate thing. We may believe that it doesn't have an impact on our children, but some of these children, you know, may grow up and then, you know, the focus tend to be on these sorts of things. And you never know, you know, when some of them go to school in grade K, you know, they start to practice some of these things that would have said to them. And a lot of
Consciously,
parents do these things, and they do it, in a very light manner, as if it's nothing.
Absolutely. Because consciously, the child may not know what to do with it, but subconsciously, subliminally, that memory is tucked away. And so when they're growing older and they're a little bit more aware, that comes to the fore. It may not be a conscious effort, but it comes to the fore. Like they're picking it out of the subconscious, subconsciousness somewhere. And then because the adult has stopped that behavior, they think that the child should stop the behavior then. But then that's when it's coming out to the child, and then they say, "Go to up one sir, why are you behaving like that?" But it's you, like you said, you set the foundation, and that child is just building on that foundation.
I find it's something which is quite prevalent in St. Lucian society, and parents, need to be more cognizant of the possible impact of that when it comes to how the child develops and how the child interacts, when the child goes to school.
That is really something. I mean, I have had a lot of run-ins with people where I have to tell them, no, it's not funny. Like they would see children behaving in such a way, mimicking adult behavior, and it's just like, and they're videotaping that, and then they circulate that all over the place. And it's like, what are you doing? You're not teaching your child anything positive.
Right.
You're teaching your child everything that is negative. And when that child builds on that foundation, you want to stop them, but by that time it's too late, because pundits will tell you that a child has already determined his or her personality as early as the age of 3 years old.
Another aspect of child sexual abuse, which I find is getting a bit common in St. Lucia, is the situation where an underage child would have taken some nude photos and possibly shared it with someone, and that person releases this photo, whether it is on WhatsApp platform or the social media platform. And that is something which I believe we have to pay careful attention to, because this situation of exposing a child is an act of child sexual abuse. Distributing nude photos of a child is an example of child sexual abuse. And there are children that this is having a devastating impact on. There are children in St. Lucia who experience suicidal ideation. These children enter a state of depression, and they do not see themselves as being worth anything. The sense of self-confidence diminishing, the self-esteem, it enters a state of downward spiral, and they do not see themselves amounting to anything. And today is actually World Suicide Prevention Day.
Right.
And it was just sometime on Friday of last week where I met a child who was a victim of a similar situation, where some photos got leaked, and that child, 3 years then, is still being re-traumatized through that kind of exposure. The child was not able to perform as well as she would have wanted at secondary school. The child at this point in time does not see any point in being alive. The child doesn't even have dreams that she would want to achieve. And I want to indicate to people that before they go out spreading these nude photos, they must always think about the devastating impact it is having upon the individual. And yes, we could say, well, the child decided to share these photos with an individual. But what we have to recognize is that some of these children, they may not be wise enough to recognize that people will manipulate them and use these photos to humiliate them. Yes, the child, to an extent, should have known that, there's a possibility of these things being released out there, but that does not justify spreading these photos.
Because children tend to think that they're indispensable. They're indispensable. Like nothing can touch them. Well, that happened to you, but it won't happen to me because I'm smarter than you are.
Or that person loves me.
Because that person loves me,
yeah,
and they never think it's going to happen to them. But one thing I want us to stress on, and I'm glad you segued into that, is the fact that to have in your possession pictures, videos, or material of a child under the age of 16 in any
a
sexual
form of child sexual
compromising
abuse.
position is a form. And also, you can be jailed, you
Yes,
can be
certainly.
arrested, and there will be a record against your name. And unfortunately, we do not yet have the sexual offenders registry, but in a number of countries, you would now be recorded as a sexual offender. And a lot of the times we don't understand that as an adult. You know, and a lot of the times when these men and women get caught, they want to put the emphasis, the blame on the child and say, well, it's the child. Look what she sent me. But my dear, you've just incriminated yourself because she cannot or he cannot give you consent. And even if he sends that, the onus is on you. It is incumbent upon you to go to the police, to go to that child's spirit, to go to the ombudsman, to go to the elders in your community, wherever, and say, listen, this child is crying out for help. This is what he or she sent me. You cannot now hold it and say, oh, that child wants me, and so I'm going to give it to her. She or he cannot consent, cannot say, I want it. And so, in effect, when you are acting on your sick fantasies, you're raping that child. And you are killing that child, because that child will never be the same again.
Yeah, certainly.
And when that gets out there, it makes it worse, because now the child is embarrassed. The whole community knows. And St. Lucia is only 286 square miles. Much as when you're living in a small community, everybody knows everybody. So when you've put that out there, that child has to go to school there, she has to go to church there, or he has to play ball, he has to, circulate and mingle amongst these very same people, and they're looking at you like a pariah. But you're just a child, and you need to be protected. Let's talk a little bit about parents who are absent when their children are growing up, whether they're absent as in out of the country or absent because they're working so hard, placing emphasis on that almighty dollar to afford those children every conceivable material thing except the psychological and physical presence of that parent.
Yeah, certainly. Though children of all socioeconomic class, different ages and backgrounds can become victims of child sexual abuse, the issue where parents are not providing adequate supervision is one that places a lot of children at risk. And what you find is that a number of perpetrators take advantage of these situations, particularly of children who are from poor families, children who are neglected, and children who have been ill-treated in certain family settings. Because when these things happen, for instance, there are children who, because of the poverty in the family, where these families are struggling to make ends meet, some of these children go out there begging for food. And these things happen in St. Lucia. There are places in St. Lucia, certain towns in St. Lucia, you would go and you would find children begging for food. This is what perpetrators of child sexual abuse actually like to see, because the child is vulnerable and they could capitalize and engage the children in sexual acts in an exchange for money or a plate of food. The other situation is that with children coming from struggling families or broken homes, perpetrators are of the view that, okay, if I do something to this child sexually, then the family may not have the economic resources to successfully get a lawyer and get them out to go for court where, they could be arrested.
Or as you say that, or it could be the flip, that they are in an economic bracket where they can afford, but they're going to be too embarrassed to haul their child through the courts and to deal with that.
Right, washma.
Right.
So there's a culture of the washma.
Not necessarily a washma as in a dollar figure, but because I am now embarrassed that I was not able to protect my child. It's not about the child at that point. It's not about me as the adult, as the parent.
Yeah.
I was not able to protect my child. So now I want people to forget that this happened. So I'm just going to hush it. I'm not going to push it, because if I do that, if I push it, then it reflects on me as a bad parent. And I do not want to be seen as a bad parent. I don't want to be seen as an absent parent. I just want it to die a natural death.
Yeah.
But these things have a way of not going away.
Yeah, certainly.
And then we have to now ask ourselves, like some children, I know a number of children girl children in particular, who are looking for a father figure.
Yeah.
Because maybe they've been abused at home by their fathers, or they've been neglected by their fathers, they've been abandoned by their fathers. So they're looking for a father figure. And the only way they know to do that, especially if they've been, when they were getting attention from their fathers, is when the mother and the father maybe had a great sexual relationship, or the father was abusing them sexually. So now to replicate that, they're going to look for a sexual relationship with an older man. But then it's incumbent upon the older man to say, no. You know, I mentor some kids. I have some kids that I work with closely. And whenever I take them out on an outing or whatever, they laugh because what I say to them is, when we go out and I said, okay, I'm going to be stepping away from you, especially the older ones, because I'm going to be stepping away from you for a little bit. But here is where I want you to stay. You can walk around, but always come back to this point every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes. And if anybody in particular, a man, speaks to you in any manner, shape or form that you're not appreciative of, there's only one thing you need to see. Don't tussle with them. Don't have a war of words with them. There's only one thing I want you to see. And I go like, yes, miss, jail bait. And I put that in their head. So every time we go out and I tell them, remember what is it? And they say jail. And they know. Because you have to teach them, you have to point out to them all the ways that people will try to infiltrate your psyche, buy you things, pay you compliments. And you know, my father has a thing, he says, sling enough mud and some mace stick. So they pay you compliments. They throw all kinds of things at you in the hopes that they're going to get a sticking point. You know, a child is going to, oh, you think I'm pretty. But that child already thinks I'm not pretty. Because of whatever abuse or whatever their background is. I'm not pretty. And you think I'm pretty? Oh, yeah, he thinks I'm pretty. So they gravitate, and then systematically you break in that child and you work on that child's psyche until that child is like eating like putty in your hands.
Certainly.
Yeah? We're due for a break, but when we come back, we have a film that we want to touch in on, and I'm hoping that we're having sufficient time to do that, because we also want to open the lines so that we can have your opinions and your views on the topic this evening. Stay tuned. Okay, so we didn't go to break, but so let's continue. Yeah, you know, sometimes you have these little glitches, right?
Yes, it's a little...
yeah, it's a long pause for not going on break. But yeah, so we will have to come back to the film a little bit off. And I just wanted to stress a little bit on rape, but I want to go back to that topic, because when we get to the film, a part of it is that cycle of rape, where guys, they rape, and the reason why they rape is because they feel powerful when they do that, and also because of the HIV epidemic. Now, I'm not so much sure that this happens in St. Lucia, but I know it happens in a lot of countries and areas in Africa and in other parts of the world, where when you have been diagnosed with HIV, then you don't want, okay, somebody gave it to me, so I'm going to give it to as many people as I possibly can, because I don't want to die alone. Or they believe that if they have sex with a virgin child, then that will help them get better. It'll help them with the cure.
I don't necessarily think the myth of having sex with a virgin child necessarily applies to St. Lucia. But clearly, having sex with a virgin child will not cure you of HIV or another sexually infected disease, sexually transmitted infected disease. However, there are people who believe that if somebody gave them HIV or a sexually transmitted disease, that it is okay for them to go out there to spread that particular infection. I believe that this is clearly unethical behavior.
It's not just unethical, it's egregious.
Yes, I do agree with you on that. I think there has to be full disclosure if you know that you have a sexually transmitted infection, that you indicate to the person that, hey, this is a situation, so if you want to proceed, so you are doing so with informed consent and having full knowledge that there is a chance of you contracting a particular disease. Now,
just hold that thought. We have a call. Good evening. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hello.
Hi.
And what's the guest name, Mr. Ever?
It's Elver. His name is Kendall Elver.
Kendall Elver.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most important.
Okay, so
shows.
Rick, you need to turn down the volume of your television. I get serious
my
feedback.
God.
Yeah.
Just give me a little second.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I'm embarrassed about that. Just bear with me, please.
Yes.
I move slowly. Let me call you back, please, Laura.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes these things happen, and with Rick's case, I tend to allow a little latitude because his contributions are always invaluable, and we have to understand that he because of his injuries, he's moving a little slower. So
I also want to say that
continue.
On the point of persons having sexually transmitted diseases, that doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody has a particular infection that it will be transmitted automatically as a result of you having sex with the person. That is if it is unprotected sex. But there are persons who engage in safe sexual practices such as condomization that could certainly reduce the risk of an infection.
And not only that, but not just the condomization. There are actually drugs right now.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
That actually reduce the viral load. So if persons expose themselves to proper care and treatment, medically and otherwise, these are things that can be prevented. However, the critical thing is that I don't think it is fair to a person. I don't think it is right for you to knowingly engage in a sexual act with another person and you know that you have a sexually transmitted infection. The person should be informed of such. And
In
I believe
particular,
in
when
some
it's a young child.
jurisdictions.
We have a call? Yes, you're on the air?
Laura, you're not going to believe this. My control fell,
Uh-oh.
and I was looking for it everywhere. I couldn't find it.
Well,
Laura, I was saying earlier on, this is probably one of the most important programs I've heard on television all the years I've been here. But I still find the scandal.
yes, Kendall.
Yes, sir.
Look, I still find even people like you have a very serious problem coming out and talking boldly about this all-important subject. I say that with respect. We, the culture, and that's a very important word in this context, doesn't allow us to talk about the worst things in the country openly. Because those things that we are talking about are the culture.
I concur.
Like the sexualizing of little children and whatnot. It's a culture, you know. That sounds terrible. That interest that we're now having there is recent. When you really think about it, this kind of show that Laura's put on tonight, and even the discourse of it is relatively recent. Would you agree with that or not?
Yes, I will agree that in terms of bringing up these issues in the media to that kind
Not
of
with the
level of
media,
discussion.
please. I'm talking about general discussion. At your home, on the marketplace, or whatever. When it is talked about, it's talked about in a nasty way.
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
That's what it is. Okay.
Yeah.
But the people, we have allowed a bunch of things to become the culture. These are the ones I refer to as the culture. We have allowed it. And all you have, and even as I speak, I know I'm rocking boats and people are pissed off hearing it. But these are the things that are important to be heard, the things that piss them off, because we brought ourselves to where we are by, in fact, embracing those things, keeping them quiet, sending little children out to perform to get money. Poverty has a lot of sin behind it. How very poor parents will use their children to earn money to take care of the little shot. That's been going on. But more than that, the matter of allowing what amounts to consensual sex in that time, 14, 15-year-olds. People know these people are having sex. They know that these people are having, and we accepted it for years and years and years. Why do you think to this day we have not had those people who impregnate 8 and 12-year-olds going to prison? The hospitals don't even report them. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, because it's so much a part of the culture. Mm-hmm. The people who are in office, a number of them are closely involved with that kind of living. Okay? So, it's interesting that when you come on the show, you cannot say how grotesque it is, because it's almost against your nature. And I watch it with keen interest, where you move from one point to even grown-up sex and consent and stopping sex in the middle of it if the woman says, I don't want to do it anymore. That has nothing to do with what we were talking about children, but it allows you to slip out of the thing about the little children. And what we don't understand is whether or not the children said yes or no, or their mother allowed it to happen or whatever, those kids are dead. Mm-hmm. Because the effects are going to be with them forever. They are dead kids. It's like rape. Dead kids. So I don't know why these subjects are not being taught openly in schools, especially in this time, especially since, like I said, it is a culture. People are having sex with underage kids. So what is the consent age now?
16.
16. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do, Kendall, is look back and think about parents that you know or cousins of yours and find out how old were their parents when their parents had them. And you will see how long the problem of
has been going on.
And 15 have been going on. So it is part of our culture. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that we have to accept is among the horrors that we have embraced and made our culture. But we don't want to develop the gonads to go out there and attack it seriously. Attack it seriously. We have police officers who are not trained to deal with stuff like that. We have a so-called embarrassment about it. We have hospitals not reporting on those cases, etc. So it's a very, very interesting program. I just want to shift one more. The guy, this is why I just kind of disagreed with both of you. You both, and I know Laura is so emotional about those things, I don't be surprised. The perpetrator is a monster. Yeah, he's a monster. But he's a very, very sick person.
Now, we're going to come to that, Rick. This is one of the things that I want to come back to, because we were supposed to go on break and there was a film that I wanted to show, but then we're having a little issue, so we didn't get into it. But one of the things that the film shows is that there's this guy who's a serial rapist, and he talks openly about it, and he's HIV positive, and the interviewer asked him, it says the guy has totally disgusted him because he knew his father, and his father and the interviewer were close friends. And so he asked him, and he said to him, when you were younger, as a kid, did anybody sexually assault you or molest you? And then you could see the change in the rapist's face, and he says, yes. When he was about 13, 14, 15, he was arrested for whatever reason, and then in the station itself, at the police station, these officers treated him like a woman. That's how he termed it. They treated him like a woman, and they sodomized him and did him all sorts of things, and he felt so disgusted, and he felt so...
Well, that is why I found it strange.
Yes.
That you all had moved away from that and now to come back to
right, because I wanted to underscore it with the film, but I don't think we'll get to the film. But I wanted.
If I may, so I save time and I get up, let somebody else call.
Right.
We always have to. I cannot stop me if I'm wrong. Almost all deviant sex people, aberrational people who engage in aberrational sex, it's almost a cliche that we know they were themselves victims, whether or not they were called victims at the time.
Yes, in many instances that would be the case.
So if we are going to be agreeing that we have allowed in our society for a very long time, 14, 15-year-olds, 16, even 16, having sex in all kinds of ways. Because you can bet your life the 16-year-old who was having sex before 16. You can bet your life on that. Okay? And if we're not going to allow ourselves to understand we have a sick person taking advantage of an innocent child,
creating more sick people in the world,
and then you have 2 sick people there now. And if of course the guy we have to be punitive where it's concerned, if only to show examples. But quite apart from the punitive aspect, there has to be an understanding of what makes those people behave that way, that they are very, very sick people, that they in fact have been victims themselves or have the whole family incestuous thing going on in a whole family, which is just usually just one woman and a guy for a few months. And at the root, my final thing, as you can tell, I was interested in something because you are. The final thing, Laura, is at the root of most of our social problems is that sexual behavior upheaval. I will leave you to concentrate on that. From the violence, most psychiatrists, psychologists will tell you, has in some way a sexual component, even when it's man beating up man, and especially when it's man beating up woman or boy beating up girl. There's a sex. Sex is involved in almost that's procreation. And we treat it so
casually.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rick, as usual. As Rick was speaking, there's a little bit of statistic that I want to share. Of all victims under age 18, 2 of 3 are ages 12 to 17 have been molested. 34% under the age of 12 and 66% age 12 to 17.
Of all victims, you meant to say, or perpetrators? Of
all victims under age 18. Like, of all of the children. Like, so there. So 2 of 3, you have a range of kids who have been molested. 2 of 3 are ages 12 to 17. Out of that, 34 of the kids, 34% are under the age of 12 and 66% are aged 12 to 17. So you're starting off your life on the back foot.
Yeah.
You're starting off life being wary of adults, being wary of an act of sexual act when you were supposed to embrace it as a part of life. It's about procreation. It's about enjoyment. But you can't even begin to have a well-functioning relationship with sex because your first experience with sex was a sexual assault.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that are the things that we have to do in terms of providing support for children who have been sexually abused. And we have to understand, like Rick indicated, that the actual impact of sexual abuse on a child never really goes away.
Never.
Some of them learn to cope, and some of them may get back into society and live very productive lives, but a number of them would struggle with it. A number of them relive these situations right throughout life. A number of them develop a sense of mistrust of individuals, and they find it very difficult to form relationships. And one of the things I would say, because I was having a conversation with...
Before you go into this one, we have another call online. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Yeah.
Good night.
Hello, good night.
Yes, good night.
George. Yeah, check it. What I got to say is the world was made by God. But now what they got, the devil running by Illuminati, different stuff in Central going on, and check it like I don't know myself, but since I study Rastafari, Christian, Muslim, all kind of stuff like that, I just going on with life and saying, under, they say 16 to 18 should be 18, and in St. Lucia, the whole world is to change it and tell you the truth. Sex and money that's been prostitute. The Bible talk about that. You check it. And what else they have again? Like I said about those evil guys, they got good guys and evil guys. I mean, like, it's mixed up. It's like messed up. They say it's married, having a good life, go in school, stuff like that, and brainwash education. I'm not just being rude and stuff. Sorry for ministers and people on air.
Okay, so we lost that call.
I mean, but like, what I gotta say is like the book, it's been tearing apart like the Bible. They got it with Darren's book with good and evil. They put like, the women from power. They put men. They put the time. They put this and that. They put guns, firearm, cocaine, crack, stuff like that. Weed. I mean, like, where life is going on. I mean, like, I'm a solution from the Bible area front. You know, I'm still on TV right now. I'm outside of my cousin's house. I mean, like, Laura, dude. I mean, like, I don't know, but where the world's going on. They say God's coming on, but if mankind with nuclear powers and weapons will take their own selves into the graves. Really, they show it like on TV, like in Justice League, Marvel, the Avengers, different stuff like that, yeah. They playing like they good, they bad. We mixed up. It's on TV, and our clothes, our dressing. I'm like so confused right now, yeah. So, I'm just what I gotta say. Check it. The other callers and people who got to say, like, and really, you check it, like, that's what.
Thank you so much for calling and for sharing that with us. Kendall, before you were saying.
Yeah, so the point I was making is that as a society, we have to recognize that the impact of child sexual molestation is something which is long-term. It doesn't even go away in some instances. And I find that we as a society, we have to be more caring. There are instances where some children who have been exposed in terms of their nude photos, based on the case I alluded to, the family does not provide enough support. They label the child as somebody who looked for it, or a child who was not well behaved. And they don't fully understand as to why the child may not recover from it. The one thing I believe is that we have to be more empathetic, especially when we have not experienced a situation. We should not be too fast to judge and say, well, that thing happened 3 years ago. Why haven't you
gotten over it? Yes.
A lot of these children struggle in terms of returning to a state to how they were before they were sexually abused.
Now, it's funny you should say that, because I think a lot of the people who are saying, why don't you get over it, are people themselves who know what it's like, who have gone through the abuse, but it is a normal thing for them. So they were abused, their parent, the mother was abused, the grandmother was abused, the great-grandmother, so it becomes a normal thing. So they just, this is a substitute once normalcy for another normalcy. So I was raped and I was sexually molested, and that's become my normalcy. Now you who aren't able to do that, why can't you do it? Because I did it. We have another call online. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hello, good night, Laura. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
And your guest, good night.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, what I'd like to say is that it's unfortunate that age of consent is 16 years and not 18. Because at 16 years, children still going to school. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that's a point. But then you will get the argument as it's still too young. Why 18 and not 21? Because all we have to do is to recall some of the recent happenings right here in St. Lucia, and then we were saying, okay, at 18. An 18-year-old should not be prosecuted in a sexual case because they're still young and they're still developing, and so it should be 21. You know. We have another call on air. Thank you for calling. You're on the air. Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, is this Laura?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I've been listening to your program. One of the things I observe about in the program, the sad thing in St. Lucia is that the young people who go through these sort of traumatic experiences are the ones that will grow up and they are now forming adults and parenting another generation of children. So we just have this cycle. It's so unfortunate, you know, and these are the sort of parents we have there now who have not even dealt with some of the issues they have experienced as children, and now they're forming part of our society.
Absolutely.
Which is very important, a part of the society, which is the family part.
Absolutely.
And this is a very unfortunate thing when I look at it,
Absolutely.
That's all
And one of the things that it's thank you for sharing that with us. I totally concur with you. But one of the things that I've noticed is that we don't even have a system in St. Lucia that can begin to provide a safety net for these children. Our system is so archaic and so undermanned and under-financed and under everything that you can think about, that it's like a drop in the bucket, whatever the social system is trying to do. It really is not enough, and it really makes the situation worse when you think about it, because now I don't want to take my kid, or my kid doesn't want to go there because there's just not enough manpower, not enough resources. We have another call. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Good evening, Laura.
Hi, good evening.
There's one thing that's really puzzling me. I've been thinking a lot about it. Why is it that when school is out, we have to charge the children as adults? What are we saying?
Why do we? I said it again.
When school is out, they are not in uniform. They have to be charged when they go into a bus. They have to be charged as an adult.
But how do you know that they're not an adult? I just met this young lady who was actually 22, and I thought she was 16.
But
so how do you know?
Primary school children, because they're not in uniform, they have to pay the adult fee.
Okay, but let me give you an example. When I was 12, I was totally mistaken for a 16-year-old, because some of us develop a lot earlier and look older. I mean, I don't look my age now, I know that. But when I was a kid, I looked older. And then as I got older, I caught up with my years, and I look younger than I actually am. So it's kind of a situation where maybe we need to think about having ID for our kids, so that they can say, okay, this is who I am, this is what it is. But it's unfair sometimes to, I'm assuming you're talking about the bus drivers and stuff.
Yes. But
it's unfair for them to just look at a child. No, but it's unfair to just look at a person and ascribe an age to them, because sometimes the person could be older and be looking younger, and sometimes the person could be younger and be looking older. So the school uniform is a catch-all. Once you're in that uniform, and depending on the uniform you're in, you know that person has to fall within that age group. You understand? Unless it's a 5-year-old. I mean, you can't charge a 5-year-old, because 5-year-olds definitely not going to look like a 15-year-old. But when you're looking at like 12-year-olds, even 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, you have some. Like my niece is 15 years old, and she's like 5'7", 5'8", and she makes me look like a midget. Now, a lot of people will look at her and be like, oh, she could not possibly be 15, but she is. You know what I'm saying? So when school is out and she goes on the bus, and the bus driver wants to charge her adult fare, unless she's with an adult who can say, no, she's only 15. What do you do? I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but
really revisit this thing.
We need to look at it. Absolutely.
Because we make them feel that they're grown.
Absolutely.
They don't have uniform, so they could go ahead and do adult things.
Absolutely. So maybe we need to.
I don't like it.
I agree with you. I understand where you're coming from, but we need a system that can allow for a child to be identified as a child. Yes. When I was in Canada, I was 30 years old, and I was asked for my ID card because I wanted to make a purchase that I could only make if I was over 18. And the person who was selling to me could not identify me as a person older than 18. And when she saw my ID as a 30-year-old, she was mortified, because I didn't look 30. Okay. So it's not something that's inherent to St. Lucia only. It's something that's all over the world. But I think we need a system in St. Lucia, like you rightly pointed out, that can identify a child as a child and not an adult.
Okay, my dear. Good night, Laura.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah. So before, I want to revisit a point that Rick made, and talking about the perpetrators who themselves were abused. And a lot of the times they repeat that vicious cycle. And in St. Lucia and other countries similar to ours, it's very difficult. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to stop the vicious cycle, because how do you when we are so resource strapped? We cannot take care of the kids when they're still kids to prevent them from growing up to be these monsters, so because we can't take care of them and give them the counseling and the care while they're still young, we're incubating, in effect, those monsters that we want to castigate and lock them away and throw away the keys. So how do we go over that? How do we circumvent that? And one of the things I want us to start thinking about are solutions. How can we now try to curb that scourge?
This is one of the things that I have been saying on Facebook, particularly when we look at issues of crime. Typically, we only frame the perpetrator as somebody who has done an injustice, not recognizing that there are some instances where these perpetrators are persons who are dealing with psychological issues or persons who have been scarred by the negative impact of social and economic issues. And that is why there is a call for justice that takes a restorative approach, where you are not just looking to punish the individual for the crime which has been committed, but you are also taking into consideration the needs of that offender. And many times, our criminal justice system in the Caribbean and a number of countries, it is very punitive. And that is why certain human rights advocates would say to you that these people have needs, and we have to ensure that some of these psychological issues have been addressed. Another thing is that we seem to have the notion that once somebody has committed a crime, that this is almost like a permanent state or a permanent label that that person must assume, or this is how this person is going to act in the future. I think we have to take an approach where, yes, there is a probability of the person reoffending. I don't want to be naive or to be loose about this. But the reality of this is that we have to ensure that our approach to justice, it is holistic, and the needs of offenders are addressed in a very adequate manner, because they too have human rights, and we need to make sure that these issues are being addressed. And that is why if you examine the new Child Justice Bill, which was passed in 2018 in St. Lucia's Parliament, it takes an approach where it focuses on rehabilitation, it takes an approach where it focuses on reintegration, and also restorative justice.
But is that just talk shop, though? Has that been actually... Because a lot of the times we have absolutely good laws and legislation on our books, but it's the enforcement of it.
Yeah, I must say the new act in terms of the Child Justice Act, it sort of modernizes the Children and Young Persons Act that we had. It gives children a greater voice in the justice process. It ensures that there is proper legal representation. It ensures that children are not being criminalized because it offers diversion options. And I think that these are things that we should have had. In terms of whether these things are operationalizing as it should, clearly we are at the initial stages, so it is difficult to say whether we are meeting what that new act is supposed to achieve. Clearly we are not meeting it as it stands right now, but the government, I need to say, has to invest more in its social agencies to ensure that they have the financial resources, they have the appropriate staff with the right skill set to address some of these issues. One of the things I note is that in St. Lucia, a number of our social programs, typically they would be financed by outside agencies. And when you look at our actual allocation from our budget, very little of it goes into financing programs that could empower young people.
What kind of programs do you think that we should put together to address that situation?
These issues. One of the things we need to recognize is that the issues that children face, these things are ecosystemic. They are caused by a number of factors coming together to produce a child who is being abused, or also, an individual who grows up abusing other people. And the approach has to be one where you address all of these issues at all levels of society. So if somebody has been abused, you have to look at the various factors that led to that particular child being abused. It could be an instance of a lack of welfare. So we have to examine our social protection system. Is it one which is not too residual to allow for persons who are poor not really getting the assistance? You have to also look at the parenting. Who is doing the parenting? Do these parents have the right skill set? And one of the things I find, Laura, is that some of the parents who are actually need to participate in some of these parenting programs, they don't come. So clearly, we have to be a bit more strategic in terms of trying to target some of these parents.
Do we have the requisite, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but do we have the requisite statistics or data to help us make those decisions and target certain areas?
We have a culture in the Caribbean, and St. Lucia has been an exception, where we don't collect enough information or do our own research
and sometimes that
to
when we
inform
do that,
our
it's
policies and programs.
And sometimes when we do that, it's retroactive, isn't it?
Yeah.
So at the time that you need the information that you've gotten is like maybe 5 years old, and you can get actual timely data, right?
Yeah, I do agree with you. This is something that we need to work on in the Caribbean region. Whereby we are informing our programs and policies by research which was carried out in a St. Lucian context. Many times children go overseas to study, and let's say you're doing a literature review on child abuse. How much information is available in St. Lucia? Not a lot, because the other thing is that there is not funding, and I believe that our government, throughout the Caribbean, need to ensure that we invest in terms of research to inform our policies. Many of these research that is out there is produced by international agencies, and some of these agencies would slant this research to reflect or inform their own policies or other work that they're doing on the ground. But sometimes they miss gaps. There are issues of cultural sensitivity that they may not have accounted for. So that is something that we really need to look at. But as I was saying, it is an approach where you have to apply a wraparound mechanism to ensure that the multiplicity of issues which are causing, for a child to be abused, that these things have been addressed. And it's not just at just one level where you say, okay, at the individual level, I'll provide the child with counseling. But what happens in the family environment that undoes some of the changes, okay, that you are trying to get the child to move down the line of. Because for instance, you're working with a child, okay, you have been abused, or you're trying to get the child not to engage in criminal activities. But all what that child sees around him or her when the child returns home is people selling drugs.
Like a drug addict,
People resolving issues, utilizing violence. Or all what the child sees is a lot of poverty, poor living conditions. So yes, you are giving the child the life skills. But when the child returns home and the mother says to the child, well, today I have no food to give you. Please proceed to KFC and do some begging, and maybe somebody will hear you out there and give you some food. But at the same time, like I mentioned earlier on, that predator may be waiting for that child and molest that particular child. So it's like you have to address it at all different levels. That's why I mentioned our social protection, how robust it is for it to capture persons who really need some assistance, and also what is driving our social protection in St. Lucia.
Sometimes I feel like we're just hamsters on a wheel and just rotating, and we're not going. Because every time we take 2 steps forward, then the funding or the resource that propelled us in the first place, it ends or it stops, and then you stagnate. By the time you're ready to get another tranche to go forward, wherever you stopped at is archaic. So you've got to go back and start again, and then you stop again, and then we don't have a systematic approach to things where we have a program which is ongoing for 5 years, and within that 5 years, while the program is going on, we now begin to source resources that we can now build upon at the end of the 5 years for another 5 and 10 years. We have somebody here who sent us an email and says, I'm blood related to this particular mom whom her boyfriend, who is the child's father, raped the child constantly from age 11 until she was 15. When the child confessed, her mom never believed her, and the father moved abroad. After 8 years, this particular mom moved to be with the same guy who raped her daughter, and that child is just left to fend for
The
herself.
Bible says to the
And-
child that it was okay for the man to have done that to the given child.
Yeah. And so where is your self-esteem at when a guy comes to you and he abuses you, or he tests the waters by slightly abusing you, and you don't do anything, you don't defend, you don't defend? Because my mom and dad never protected me. My dad, who was supposed to have been my protector. We have a call?
Yeah, okay.
We have a call on line. Thank you for
Hello,
calling. Yes, hello?
Yes. What about those 15-year-old girls that are big men?
The 15-year-old.
15-year-olds that are big men.
That 15-year-old that are with big men?
That is big men.
But we
men
just
helping them financially.
But we just talked about that. These men have to understand.
And they don't speak. They don't speak. They don't report that.
The 15-year-old?
They don't report it. Yeah. They don't report the matter.
Do you want to handle that? Do you want to take that on?
What did the person
Okay, so
say?
thank you for that. He's saying that what about the 15-year-olds who are with big men and they're not reporting it to the police? But I think in our earlier dissertation we talked about that.
Yeah.
The child cannot be with a big man. The big man is with the child. And so, but go ahead, deal with that.
Certainly, this is something which is illegal. The child cannot consent to having sex below the age of 16. The other aspect of this that we should be looking at is that, for that matter to be prosecuted, the child must be empowered to come forward and say, yes, this person did have sex with me.
And we just talked about that, where you get the life skills. But
yeah, you have situations where some of these children, they believe that they are in love with that individual, and then by way of trying to protect that individual, they do not come forward and say, yes, that person had sex with me. That is something which happens quite often in our society. And that is where there is a need for persistency when it comes to empowering our children with the life skills, with the confidence to come forward to ensure that these sexual predators do not take advantage of them. Many cases go through the cracks because of that kind of culture, where some of these children don't understand the impact of being in relationships of this nature, where they are being marginalized, where they are being exploited by older men. They don't fully understand the impact it can have upon them, and so they do not see a need for them to come forward. But I think that as a society, we need to continue to educate our children to ensure that they will realize that this is nothing which is in the best interest, since, as I've indicated earlier on, that could compromise the holistic development.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to go back a little bit and talk about we touched on it. What can now we do? And I know we know that we're resource strapped, and but do you think that it should be? Oh, let me put a pin on this one, and let me come back and ask you this: what happens when a child is abused sexually, and the perpetrator has been taken into custody and been granted bail and sent back into the same community as the child? So the child is living there. The child has suffered this indignation. This child is safety net has been ripped from under them, and then that person, that perpetrator, now has to come back to the same, and that person has already threatened that child, but they're released to come back into the same community. How do we deal with that? What can our legislators do to ensure that these two people do not cohabit in the same space?
Well, clearly that's a legal issue, because the magistrate would make a decision on that based on whether he or she thinks that the child is at risk of being remolested. But what I find is that...
Not just remolested, but hurt. Because remember, that child has already been threatened. If you tell anybody, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to kill your mom, I'm going to do this to your family. But then through circumstances, that person has been found out. So that person has been taken into custody, remanded, granted bail, and now they're...
In any instance, if the magistrate, based on the initial hearing, is of the persuasion that the child is at risk, or, you know, the cause of justice may become compromised if the person is released, then the magistrate is very likely not to allow for the person to return to the community. But an assessment will be made. Lawyers will put forward the arguments, and
because either way, every way you slice it, it's somebody's civil rights are going to be impinged upon. So you can't deny the person bail because it's his right. Or
because the other issue is that the person is innocent until proven guilty.
Until proven guilty, and then you can't tell them, well, you can't come back to the community because where else am I going to live? Are you telling me now to become homeless and become a social statistic, to go to another area? How do you protect that child? Do you now take that child, rip that child out of the home, that the only home that they know, and put them in foster care or in protective care? You know, there are all these issues at stake, and we don't seem, as adults, seem to think about those things and the repercussions of our actions when we decide to offend.
But in such situations where a child has been molested and the matter goes through the family court, what you would have is that the social workers will still be attached to that child, or the counselors. And then if the child has indicated that if the person returns, that it may cause them to be traumatized, or it may have a negative impact on them, I believe that the social worker will, you know, actually present these things in the initial hearings. Also, the lawyers of that particular child will make representation indicating that there is a possibility of such being a harm onto the child.
Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, there was this case where a student had a situation similar with a teacher. And it's like you said, that teacher was innocent until proven guilty. But when the teacher was granted bail and whatever, the teacher now had to come back in the same environment as the child, and the child could not be removed from the environment. The teacher could not be prohibited from being in that environment. And the child was the one who was displaced. The child had to leave school because obviously the teacher is at the same school, had to leave school, had to be sent to another school, had to miss out a year of school, had to be sent abroad because, you know, again, like I said earlier, the family want to preserve the child's dignity as much as possible, so she was sent abroad. Then she came back. When she came, the teacher had moved from the school by that point. When she came back to the school, the teacher now came back to the school, and so that child just never lived in St. Lucia again. And I mean, as an adult now, but never lived in St. Lucia again. And it's all of the upheaval was on the part of the child and not on the part of the adult who should have known better, being a teacher and all. So, you know, it's kind of always the child is the one who is being affected.
Yeah, I take your point on that, because that's what I was going to recommend. I mean, if the social worker who's accompanying the child or the probation officer, whoever, you know, is assisting the child, that may be what they have to resort to. Because from a legal standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, the offender or the person who has been charged with the crime has certain rights that we have to respect as a society. And, you know, the lawyers will argue, well, I mean, for what reason can that person not return? But like I said, I think our criminal justice system, it has been a bit more accommodating of these issues. I know for sure before, you know, sentencing is done, they do factor in all of these sorts of factors, you know, through a pre-sentence report. So it's not just legalistic issues that will come into consideration. Our magistrates have been taking an approach whereby they consider the impact such things can have on children. Yeah.
We're running out of time. What would your takeaway? What would the takeaway be for parents of children who have been abused, children who are listening or watching, who are currently being abused, and to persons out in the society who have abused, who were abused, and who are thinking of abusing?
Well, what I can say to St. Lucians and other people who are listening is that child abuse is something that we should all be concerned about. This is something which is having a very devastating impact on our children, and the impact is long term, and sometimes children never recover from such situations. We all have to help that child recover. However, as a society, we need to ensure that children who go through these situations, that they are provided with the right support by way of psychological counseling, any other issues that may surface, that these matters are attended to. Support must be provided to the families of these children. They must be equipped with the right skill set and knowledge to provide support to these children, because sometimes they may actually re-traumatize the children by making negative remarks at them, for blaming them as to why they were abused, because these things do happen in our St. Lucian culture. I believe that in terms of parents, we have to observe our children, we have to listen to our children, and if a child has come and said that they have been abused, we have to take it seriously and report the matter to the police. And to children, what I want to say is that please understand that anytime that you engage in sexual intercourse prior to the age of consent, there are damages that you can suffer. It could derail your future, and you have to be very careful. You have to empower yourselves. And people sometimes may pressure you into engaging into sexual acts, but I think that your focus at this point in time is supposed to be your education and achieving certain goals that you have set for yourself, as opposed to allowing people to take advantage of you. But I just believe that on a whole, as a society, we have to be more empathetic. We have to continue to advocate so that at least these issues would become very high on the priority list of the government, so at least government would put the right systems in place, invite the right resources to ensure that our children are being protected. And let me also say that even for the persons who commit such acts, we also need to have the right programs for them to ensure that they will not reoffend. But all in all, I believe that we should see children as a priority, and we all have a part to play in terms of ensuring that children are protected and their well-being is assured.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Thank you for coming through. But kickstarting our Let's Talk About Sex, it's unfortunate that it had to have that slant, but I think it's a very important slant, because this is taking into consideration the very youngest of us all, and they're going to be growing into sometimes dysfunctional adults because their foundation is very shaky. So I want to thank you so much for dealing with that, and I want to thank CHF for doing the work that they're doing, and to continue and to showing more, having a more public profile where this is concerned, because I think it's very, very, very important that we do that. I want St. Lucians to remember that of all